I'll start the presentation by giving a general overview of American beech ecology. I'll talk about the role of this tree as both wildlife food and habitat for many species. I'll also talk about some spatiotemporal cycles and seed masting, because beech nuts are what we consider to be a mast species. They are not produced every year by the trees, and the impacts that this has on population demographics of both forest components in the plant side as well as the animal side, predator-prey relations, even looking at some aspects of human-wildlife conflict that relate to this beech seed cycle. And although I will not talk in great detail about the specific causes or signs of beech bark disease, because many others have described that invasive native species complex very well, I do talk a lot about beech bark disease's impact on the forest, both historically and at present. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some current research that's happening with regard to this topic. So I hope you enjoy. The range of American beech is found throughout the eastern half of North America. In this study of the relative abundance of witness trees across New England and the Northeast, you can see that in the pre-colonial times on the left, majority of the trees that were marked in towns for what were called witness trees was actually comprised of beech trees. This doesn't necessarily represent the entire composition of the forest, but it is interesting in that the trees that were there were large enough to be considered useful for witness trees and marking lot lines. In contrast, in today's forest, the vast majority of those same places is dominated by maple, and there's only one spot in the central Adirondacks that actually still has a proponent of beech. This, according to the authors, has to do partly with climate and disease factors, but also the vast majority of the change is more likely due to logging and deforestation from the settlement of New Englanders moving across the region. So today, when we look at American beech basal area across the region, the stronghold of that species is found in the central Adirondacks. This data is from the USDA Forest Service FIA data set. Given that this is the case, the history of the land and the ecological factors that contribute to this might mean that land managers and foresters and scientists might benefit from actually working with the land's tendency to want to move into a forest that's beech and hemlock dominated, rather than fighting it. Certainly in New York, the Adirondack Park and the administrative protections against logging and removal of trees on state lands, which is the case across about 3 million acres of state forest preserve, would tend to favor the growth of beech. And the land use and changes for invasive species are going to exacerbate that situation. For context, the Adirondack Park is about 6 million acres in size. It's about the size of the state of Vermont, and it's actually the largest park in the continental US. As you can see here, about 5 or 6 national parks and other parks fit inside the boundaries of the Adirondacks. So for scale, it is actually a very interesting place to consider when we look at it from a land management standpoint, when we look at it from a forest standpoint. So the fragmentation is lower here than it is across most of the rest of the eastern forest. It's been an interesting cultural history as well, and we have an opportunity to use the information that we've collected here in the middle of the park on an experimental research forest, as well as the larger landscape, to talk about patterns across the region. So just briefly, the Adirondack Park is not maintained by any one agency. It's actually overseen by the State Department of Environmental Conservation, which oversees lands, forests, waters, wildlife, recreation, and anything having to do with the public resources at large. It's also overseen by an agency called the Adirondack Park Agency, which is essentially a sort of a super zoning agency. The APA created a map and actually, in concert with DEC, manages both the private lands in terms of what's allowed to happen with regard to development and use, as well as overseeing the large cases of the state lands. So here in this map, you can see the mix of colors. Unlike a national park where the land use is all going to be one type, this park has quite a few. I haven't actually colored in all of the, or identified all of the colors of the map, but you can see there the first three: resource management, rural use, and the high, medium, and low intensity use. Those are all private land classifications, going in increasing amount of what's allowed in terms of numbers of buildings per unit of land, the types of activities that are allowed. Resource management is really the private timberlands managed mostly for forest products. Rural use tends to be agricultural in nature. You can see that it's mostly on the periphery of the park. The other two classes there, wild forest and wilderness, those are state land classes. That's public land. So those are the big chunks that you hear a lot about, like the High Peaks Wilderness, which is right in the middle of the park. There are quite a few wildernesses. They're mostly the big contiguous unbroken blocks. Some have had a past forest management history, but all of these, since the state acquired them, which largely was in the 1890s and around the turn of the century, those lands have not been managed for any type of forest activity other than recreation. Wild forest has slightly less restrictive activity. You can, there are some things allowed in wild forests like bicycling, which is not allowed in wilderness. But these are essentially gradations of land use so that the park management dictates, which are protecting natural resources as well as allowing humans to recreate and enjoy and use the lands appropriately, is maintained. SUNY ESF's Huntington Wildlife Forest is an experimental station in the central Adirondacks. It's 15,000 acres or 6,000 hectares in size, so it's large enough that we can do some controlled experiments and also established long-term plots across the forest. We've been looking at tree growth, community composition, effective management, and then of course things like beech bark disease with regard to this invasion and the ecology of the forest, both in terms of the plant community and the wildlife community, as this change has been happening over the past several decades. It gives us a nice comparison because on the Huntington Wildlife Forest, we're able to manage the forest, whereas in the Adirondack Park, management of private lands is allowed, but management of public lands is limited to recreation, and there is no harvesting of trees allowed on what's called Forever Wild Forest Preserve. That's the land that the state holds within the park. So the value of beech to both people and the forest ecosystem is multidimensional. People use beech for saw timber, paper, firewood. Often they're used as ornamental trees in landscaping. There are a lot of products that can be derived out of beech. It's a very hard wood. At the same time, its value to the wildlife in the community is in the food that it produces, the fact that animals can nest and den in cavities in the tree. When the tree dies, the downed wood could serve as habitat for a lot of animals on the forest floor. And it's certainly true that this tree is often maligned because it is of low value economically. Often it's considered to take up space where more desirable trees can grow. And certainly the thick understory that results from beech suckering and root sprouting does negatively impact biodiversity and forest function and can require expensive treatments. So while I agree with that assessment, I think it is worth it for us to look at the beech holistically and think about how we might consider its advantages and think about ways to integrate it into silviculture and forest management in a more integrated fashion. Somewhere around 40 different species of wildlife eat parts of beech. Most of them are vertebrates that we're aware of, although there certainly are some insects. And most of the consumption has to do with eating beech nuts. Most species, white-tailed deer included, are not likely to browse the leaves. They're very full of lignin and hard to digest. They also have some secondary plant compounds that make digestion by herbivores difficult. So they're not preferred as a forage species, but the nuts most certainly are. So beech nuts are considered to be a hard mast. The food that is eaten by animals, it tends to ripen in late summer and early fall. The peak in the Northeast is typically about mid-October when the seeds are ripe and they fall out of the tree, out of the ground. General trees need to be about 40 or 50 years old to produce this mast, this crop. These trees are usually at least 8 inches in diameter, and trees that are larger tend to have higher seed production. Masting, though, does not occur every year. It's a cycle. It tends to be between 2 and 4 years in our region, and it's certainly affected by weather. Essentially, the pattern is that a dry summer followed by a wet summer would result in a high mast crop that autumn. So I'll share some data to that effect. A lot of animals in particular use beech nuts to store calories either on their body, in the case of black bears, because they're actually consuming them in the fall and converting that to stored fat, or as food cache, which is cache is the word C-A-C-H-E, is in a pile of nuts that they save. Smaller animals like mice and chipmunks can't physically put on that much fat, so they will collect the food and then use it. So these are either animals that are employing hyperphagy, which is eating a lot of food in preparation for winter, the pre-denning period that bears go through for that winter hibernating period, or for the animals that are awake and use perhaps periodic torpor to conserve energy, they will wake up and eat nuts out of their food cache during the winter. For a lot of these species, it's actually a very critical source of food and can mean the difference between survival and death into the next spring. If we compare the nutritional content of beech nuts to oak acorns and other types of foods that black bears and other animals would commonly encounter in the forest, what we find is that the fat content of beech nuts is actually higher than the other foods that they're likely to be eating. This is really important when it comes to preparation for winter, because animals have to meet energetic and often reproductive thresholds to be able to be successful into the future. So in this case, we see beech nuts have several times more fat than herbaceous species, agricultural foods like corn, and other foods that they might be encountering. So while others have treated the stages of beech bark disease in great detail, I'm just going to briefly talk about what we saw at the Huntington Wildlife Forest here in the Adirondacks. The advanced front was seen in 1967, and those first few years when the non-native scale insect was invading and coming in, being noticed on the trees, the researchers were finding that that was happening in the late 60s and early 70s. The second stage was the killing front. This is when the fungus comes in and invades the tree, killing the live bark. We've seen initially in the first wave about 25% of the trees of large size died in that first few years. But by 1980, a decade later, about 80% of the beech that were greater than 40 centimeters in diameter had been killed from beech bark disease. So in the aftermath stage, which is when you have declining health of beech trees and very few are seen to be resistant, something like 1% is the research. That stage began in the Central Adirondacks in 1974, and it's continued for several decades. So trees of smaller and smaller sizes have continued to die. We've seen that happen on our long-term research plots. By about the year 2000, 99% of the stems that did not have any sign of beech bark disease were smaller than 15 centimeters diameter, suggesting that the trees, like in other places in the range of beech bark disease, the large trees went first. They died initially, and then the scale and the fungus combination has continued to affect the smaller size classes of the trees. So that, of course, has resulted in a lot of young beech suckers in the understory. It's resulted in physiological changes to the trees and to the forest, and of course there's probably attendant genetic changes that have happened with that. So because the beech tree has such an important role for wildlife and in the forest, we looked at some historical data before the advent of beech bark disease from the mid-century. And at that time, although we don't have quantitative data, the information that we have based on tree sizes suggests that there would have been something like a huge decline in beech nuts from beech bark disease, something like 37% based on what we saw in the 70s and 80s. If nuts per hectare was estimated at 800,000 pre-beech bark disease, it's cut to maybe a little bit more than half of that at the aftermath stage, And so what's happening since then? That's one of the things that some of my research has been focusing on with regard to the forest here and then across the reach of beech trees. So when we looked at the 20 to 30 years after the killing front went through the central Adirondacks, in that post-beech bark disease time, what were some of the vegetative changes that we saw? We chose to study an unmanaged 300-year-old forest that's called the natural area on the Huntington Wildlife Forest. And in this area, we've got a lot of data that told us that, as one would expect, we have seen a decline in the largest northern hardwood trees that have been the canopy dominance over time. This is probably due to senescence of things like sugar maple and yellow birch that are reaching the end of their lifespan. It's almost certainly due to beech bark disease impacting the largest beech. As you would expect, we've seen an increase in the number of beech saplings. We've also seen an increase in the number of beech logs, but they've been of smaller size classes because we've already, at this point in the aftermath forest, we've already lost the largest beech trees back when the killing front occurred. As a result, we're seeing fewer beech snags, but the beech bark disease stages and the amount of disease prevalent on the boles of the trees has actually increased, at least over this period of time, suggesting that the disease complex is still actively activating in the forest. We did see increases in shrub richness, which suggests that there might be some potential for some stand replacement and perhaps some gap canopy light dynamic changes happening. Some of those larger trees have fallen out. And interestingly, in both this unmanaged stand as well as several managed stands that we've been looking at, we are seeing increases in beech nut production. This is counter to the model that was created, suggesting that beech nut production has declined with the advent of the beech bark disease. Since that time, in the aftermath forest, we've actually seen beech nut production rising. And there's some interesting implications for that, as well as some interesting research opportunities. In a different study focusing on several managed stands of northern hardwoods, we were looking at the presence of beech understory thickets, so these young, dense sapling stands, and comparing them to similar forests that did not have the thickets. What we found was that, as expected, when we looked at thickets, there were about 4 times as many sapling stems per meter squared as in the non-thicket forest. And the litter depth on average was higher in the thicket, suggesting that deeper litter is probably coming from the beech, which is perhaps slower to decompose than some of the other leaves and debris that might have an impact on seedlings and wildflowers that are establishing in the forest floor. And it could be a net negative or it could be a positive depending on moisture and light and other things. But in general, we certainly saw a major negative impact of beech thickets on plant diversity. Plant richness was much lower in the thickets, particularly both the herbaceous species as well as the ferns and the shrubs. So certainly it is clear that the prevalence of beech dominating the forest is having negative impacts on at least plant diversity. So just to sum up that study, we are probably seeing that the beech sapling thicket is very competitive and is going to exclude a lot of the other plant species that are trying to establish or grow up into the forest canopy. So we did not look at what caused the thickets. We didn't look at land use history or drainage or management type. So there are some other potential opportunities to study that, but just looking at the actual physical presence of the thicket, we were seeing very clear negative impact on plants. This, of course, has implications for community richness, composition, and wildlife habitat. A colleague at SUNY ESF, Emeritus Professor Dr. Ralph Nyland, has often said that the only good beech is a dead beech. But is that really true? Aren't there reasons why dead trees can be valuable to wildlife, including beech? For example, beech logs can lie on the forest floor for several years and they provide runways for small animals to hide from predators. These can also be cooler and wetter places for amphibians and invertebrates that are sensitive to moisture change. If there are a lot of logs that have fallen from beech bark disease, this could create habitat, particularly in managed forests where there might not be a lot of other downed woody material that's being contributed to the forest floor. As we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of nests and cavities that can be used in standing snags as well as downed logs. So I would posit that there are actually a lot of reasons why dead beeches can also be good. Turning our attention back to live American beech and looking at the comparison of seed production in unmanaged forest across the stand. We've been collecting annual seed data since 1988 on 25 northern hardwood plots. We go out every fall and collect the nuts, identify them, look for viability, look for wildlife use. And then we also compare that data to several stands that have had a variety of management treatments, primarily on the selective logging end of the spectrum. Those forests actually have individually tagged trees where we're following the nut production of an individual tree over time as it grows or potentially dies. So we can say something about seed production trends between management types as well as through time. In this graph, we're looking at the annual production of beech nuts over time for about 20 years. And what you can see is that on the side of the y-axis, that's mass production in seeds per hectare. So there's quite a dramatic difference between one year to the next. If you see the high spikes, and then those faded light green bars are years of massed failure when there were little to no nut production. What we've seen in our modeling is that there's a year lag. This is this 2-year cycle that shows up in the beech nut production, where you're not going to get very often 2 years of nut production back to back, but you also tend not to get 2 years of failure back to back. That does happen occasionally. So there's a 2-year and a 4-year cycle going on here. The massed crop can be 100 times more productive than years where there's a failure of the beech mast. This is really highly synchronized across both species of trees as well as geographic region. We see very high correlation between American beech, sugar maple, mountain ash, and many of the conifer species. And they're not all entirely in lockstep, but there are some environmental factors that are driving that with regard to weather patterns in a given year, carbohydrate stores in the tree roots, and other factors. So we often talk about small mammals as a group, but actually they all have fairly different life strategies, and it's worth looking into that with relating to their energetic needs, sources of food, and how beech nuts might play into their lives. Here I'm showing several fairly common species that are found in the Northeast. We've got some different strategies in different colors, and essentially the green colors means that those are species that do cache seeds like beech nuts. Red means that the animals do not cache, and yellow means that we're not sure. So what this is telling us is that chipmunks, squirrels, and deer mice definitely will cache beech nuts and other seeds. Jumping mice are hibernators. They don't cache food because they don't access it during the winter because they're not awake. Other species might cache types of foods. Shrews are actually insectivores, but they are known to eat beech nuts, even though they're considered to be functionally earthworm and beetle and other insect arthropod strategists from a food standpoint. Red-backed voles tend to be herbivores, so they're not as affected by the beech mast or the food production swings from year to year, but a lot of these other species are highly impacted, and their population numbers and their demographics is very tightly tied to the beech mast cycle, as I'll show you. So here at the Huntington Wildlife Forest, we can put together the annual beech nut production seed data with our annual live trapping of small mammals. In this case, we're looking at deer mice. So here you've got beech nuts in the bars, and the numbers of nuts, just raw numbers, is on the left-hand y-axis. On the right axis is the number of mice that are captured per a unit of effort, 100 trap nights. So as you can see, every time there's a fall where there's an abundance of beech nuts, that following year we see an uptick in the mice. Particularly this past year when we had a huge beech nut crop in the autumn of 2019, the summer of 2020 was a big spike in the numbers of mice. And anecdotally, a lot of people were complaining about it because the mice were getting into their houses and cabins and food stores. So what does this mean for the forest and function, and what does it mean for the beech tree? It means that this tree is highly synchronous across the landscape. So we're going to see big changes in the amount of energy that's being put into the system. It means big changes from year to year in things like wildlife survival, and it can potentially mean things for human health as well, in particular with looking at disease vectors. If we talk about predators, they are often indirectly impacted by beech mast because they're consuming the animals that are eating the beech nuts. There's usually going to be a time lag, and I'll show you some data to that effect. We often see predators switching prey items when something is more available and easier to catch or more numerous. So these would be owls and other raptors, bobcats, coyotes, a lot of the generalist predators that are willing to switch. If there suddenly are a lot of mice on the landscape, they will target those animals, for example. So beechnut and the beechnut production over time actually can impact predators' numbers, predator demographics, and competition between predator species. The two pictures are showing a beechnut cache that actually was from an American martin that was probably raiding a mouse's food store of beechnuts under the snow, but it was a martin den. We see a lot of the mustelids, so these would be the weasels, martin, and fisher in the Northeast. They are certainly preying on small mammals, and in some of their cases, they'll actually eat the nuts directly. And we've even seen more aquatic species like river otters actually directly eating beech nuts. These are all species that are long and lean, and they don't really, evolutionarily, they have not really got capacity to pack on a lot of pounds like a bear or a deer. So it's really important for them to be able to take advantage of these external stores of food like beech nuts when that is available. If we switch to talking about the birds that often key in on beech nuts, we know the most about blue jays, because blue jays tend to pick beech nuts out of the tree, and they'll fly and cache their nuts, sometimes up to several kilometers away. This, of course, has implications on potentially tree expansion in terms of the tree's range, because beech nuts might be being dispersed and moved by that activity if the blue jay never comes back to get the nut. It can also create clusters when the beeches are seedlings that are planted from that seed source and grow from that dispersal activity. It's interestingly, blue jays are actually really good at picking the sound nuts that are viable. They're very good at just being able to key in on the nuts that actually are viable, and we're not really sure why that is, but they're better at it than humans, actually. Other birds that need or that take advantage of that food source when it's available from beech nuts are animals like ruffed grouse, and certainly turkeys, which are thought to be more of an oak hickory species. Certainly that's where they kind of evolved habitat-wise in the southern part of the US. But as turkeys expand into northern climates, they seem to be adapting quite well to being able to eat beech nuts and other food sources. So when that nut is available in the fall, every other year or so, that food becomes tremendously critical for some of these bird species. Most people know the story of the passenger pigeon, which went extinct. These were birds that were flocking in the millions. They were working out of giant colonies, moving around the mid-Atlantic and into Pennsylvania, New York, and up into the Great Lakes states and northern forest into Canada. What people don't think about a lot is that they were eating oak acorns and beech nuts, and certainly would have been moving around on a large landscape level, probably to some degree in response to the mast crops in a given year, and they would have had major impacts on the forest because of that movement that they would do, both in terms of being a food source for other species, including humans, as well as an impact on the trees themselves. If you think about it, it's interesting to consider that some researchers think that the extinction of the passenger pigeon might be partly why we have seen an increase in white-tailed deer and mice, because passenger pigeons would have been a nut competitor from a food standpoint from those species. And of course, it goes without saying that beech nuts are tremendously important to black bears. This picture really just answers the question of what bears do in the woods. So the picture on the right is a picture of a bear scat that is absolutely full of beech nuts, and that's a truck key for scale. On beech trees, we can often see the evidence of black bears having climbed the tree in past seasons to actually access the beech nuts. One of the things bears will do is they will sit in a high fork and they will break off the end branches of the tree, eat the nuts, strip them, and then stuff the branch underneath themselves, creating what's called a bear nest. Bears do not nest in trees, but in beech trees, cherry trees, walnuts, and other species of seed-producing trees, the bears will create these structures that are really just more of a feeding platform that's convenient for them so that they don't fall out of the tree. So not only are beech nuts important to black bear survival, but they're also actually critical to reproduction. One of the things that we have seen in our research is that there's a high degree of synchronicity across the entire region, and we can actually predict reproduction and success of black bears in Maine by using Adirondack, New York, beechnut mass data. So a study in Maine showed that 80% of bear sows reproduced after a nut year, where there was a lot of mast and food available to the females, but only 22% of the females would actually successfully reproduce after a poor nut year or a failure. We also have seen that that mass of reproductive age female bears is higher after beech mast, and that is what is allowing them to be more successful at raising their cubs in the early part of the spring. So the cubs are born in the den and they're supported by the mother, but the mother has to be of a reproductive plane energetically high enough to actually support those cubs. When we looked at beech mass density, just looking at the numbers of nuts produced, that was the best explanatory factor for explaining the actual population size of Adirondack bears. So we looked at harvest data and compared that through time, and what we could see is it's a numeric response on the part of the black bears that has to do with this reproduction factor. We find that in the Adirondacks, the number of negative interactions between black bears and humans is negatively related to beech mast. So in other words, in years where there's a lot of food available, there tends to be fewer bear conflicts with people, bears getting reported as being a problem to our New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. It isn't the only factor running this comparison between bear complaints and beech nuts, but it is an important factor. The weather certainly has an impact too. So if you look at this data, we're showing numbers of beech nuts again from the Huntington Wildlife Forest, and superimposed on that, the regional complaints about bears that people have made to the state agency. So in 2017, there was a lot of beech mast. In 2018, there was hardly any. It was a very hot, dry summer. And so there were a lot of young bears running around on the landscape, having survived that previous winter. They were hungry, they were novices, and they weren't really sure where they were going from a behavioral standpoint. They got into a lot of trouble. There also was a spike in tourism, and the number of complaints might also have something to do with just more potential for there to have been bear-human conflicts. So this is not a one-to-one relationship with beech mast, but it's interesting that we can see a very strong pattern with that food pulse that happens periodically through the years, and the relationship with things like problematic relationships between wildlife and humans. So clearly one of the things that we find useful is to apply that science and use the data that we have. If we can predict a good food year looking at beech nuts, if we can predict a bad food year with regard to food scarcity, we might be able to be more proactive and help do public education, get people out there and have folks that are in the woods recreating or being out engaging, be more bear aware and be smarter about what the conflict potential is, as well as making sure that the agency representatives and the personnel are trained and ready to deal if it is going to be a bad year for human-wildlife conflicts. Now we'll switch gears and talk about some additional wildlife research and some management opportunities and implications. So now I'm going to talk about a study that was done comparing different long-term data sets, some of which was reported from hunting and trapping agency data from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, from the state of Maine, and from parts of Canadian provinces, and data that was collected in the Central Adirondacks looking at beech nuts and small mammal population numbers. For management reasons, the New York State biologists were interested in looking at American marten and fisher populations. We know that they are both consuming small mammals as well as nuts and berries. They're fairly wide-ranging in their food choices. They will eat things like birds, bird eggs, amphibians. And so these are animals that would be both directly and indirectly impacted by the beech mast pattern that we see. When we first looked at the small mammal abundance over time, this data from the ESF Huntington Wildlife Forest shows there's that pattern where the beech mast failures, which are those lighter bars, are the years where we see an uptick in the small mammal population. And this is looking at all total captures combined from summer, from a multi-year period. But there's a correlation between small mammal numbers and the food availability from the preceding year. So if we compare the regional harvest from New York east to Maine and New Brunswick, we can see a high degree of spatiotemporal synchronicity in the numbers of animals harvested from year to year. There's the number differs because the scale of harvest is quite different from New York State, where the region is fairly small that's allowed for trapping, compared to the Maine and New Brunswick regions, but the pattern is the same. And this is obviously going to be related to a variety of environmental factors that are happening in the forest. What we see is that this harvest pattern is extremely correlated with the beech mast pattern. To have an R-squared of 0.84 from an ecological data set that was not experimentally manipulated is actually quite impressive. And I personally rarely ever see ecological data be that clear. So this is really telling us how important that beech mast pattern is to the population of American marten in our region. If we look at the same data for the fisher across that region, we see the pattern is not as clear. There are reasons for that. One, fisher have a larger range across which they're interacting habitat-wise, so they can be found in agricultural or potentially ex-urban environments, whereas the marten tends to be found more in the, call it forest proper. We're going to still see a pattern. There is still a correlation with beech mast through time, but the correlation is a lot weaker. Still significant. A 0.4 R-squared is still pretty good. But what that says is that fisher are not as tightly tied to the beech mast, probably because they're more of a generalist species when it comes to their diet. They will switch and eat more things more readily than a marten would. So the study in conclusion tells us that, again, beech plays a very key ecological role in the northern forest as a food source for a lot of species. We're seeing major population demographics affected by the beech mast. And the food availability from the caloric content of beech certainly is going to be part of that, because it's exceptional in the forest with regard to the kind of nutrients that animals are getting. We're also seeing that cycle has effects on conflicts with people, demographics that are both immediately happening as well as a time lag effect, because it takes a year or so for mustelids to have the food that they eat from the small mammals converted into energy that allows them to have higher numbers of litter sizes, higher reproduction and success of those litters, and then those young animals actually making it onto the landscape as mature adults the year later. So there's a lag there that happens in those population demographics. We do know, of course, that there's other factors happening here. There's competition between these species. There's differences in habitat quality across the region. Beech mast is certainly not the only factor that's causing this synchronicity, but it is a major force in the life of a lot of these animals that we've been talking about. The other thing that's useful to conclude from this work is the nut model that was produced in the 1980s from the Adirondacks was definitely correct for individual beech trees. The more beech bark disease and the more severe a tree has beech bark disease, the lower its nut production. That is true. But it ended up not being correct on a landscape scale because there's some other compensatory mechanism happening with either just the number of beech trees out there that are collectively producing nuts. So our nut model was incorrect because over time we've seen nut production actually increase since the time of the aftermath forest. But looking at plant diversity, plant community structure, and looking at these different aspects of the forest obviously tells us that things are going to continue to change, and the aftermath forest is not a static environment. Things are continuing to change with regard to the beech bark disease itself. Things are continuing to change with regard to the interactions between the species on the northeast forest landscape. So if we change topics a little bit to managing the forest, looking at this situation where a lot of the landscape now has beech thickets or high numbers of beech stems that are competing out other components of the plant community and having a lot of impacts on the forest structure and function, what could potentially be done about it? Certainly research teams are looking at this question across the US and Canada, and I want to share with you one study that's happening right now that could produce some potential answers for this. So in this photo, this is a typical look at the unmanaged, what we would consider to be similar to old growth forest. We've got dominant sugar maple in the right-hand side of the photo. We've got a lot of young beech stems, many of which are infected with beech bark disease. And in the middle, there's a seed collection device that's a 5-gallon bucket. So essentially, in the foreground is where we're standing today. This is still these dominant trees in the canopy, but they're aging out. In the middle of the forest, we've got beech nuts, and that's a cornerstone of so many components of this forest. In the background, we've got this sort of inexorable march of beech. So this is what we're looking at coming at us in the future. But is this a done deal? And can we rehabilitate these stands? And are there opportunities for us to use this scientific principles that we know about silviculture and management to deal with this issue? So if we agree that we want to keep some component of American beech on the landscape, how do we choose which trees, which forests, and which management opportunities? People have tried herbicides, people have tried mechanical treatments. What are we thinking that might be a good management strategy at this point to help grow beech into mature size classes and to have there be a balance of forest community types and components? We are trying what we're calling a rehabilitation harvest on the Huntington Wildlife Forest in a stand that has been managed. It has fairly high quality soils. Right now it's dominated by sugar maple, yellow birch, white ash, and some beech and some conifers, but it's definitely being replaced by this degraded, lower diversity beech forest. So we are trying mechanical control, and we're going to evaluate the ecological impact, the silvicultural impact, and the economic impact so that we can see, can one rehabilitate and promote and retain that desirable species, and what's the economic impact of doing that kind of harvest. So we've been undertaking a commercial beech control study, which is looking at both the plant community, vascular, and the epiphytes that are found on some of these mature and older trees that have a lot of structure and bark features to them. We're looking at microclimate impacts of the harvest, and we're looking at several taxonomic groups of wildlife, including bats, small mammals, and songbirds. And we've been doing a study. We've got some years of pre-harvest data, and now we are currently in the process of collecting the during and post-harvest data. There are also some other avenues to look at beech management, including obviously continuing to study the growth, mortality, and reproduction of the trees themselves. We're interested in how to select beech that might be retained to have a wildlife value, that would be these trees that produce nuts and are worthy of keeping on a landscape. It's possible that we might have some kind of a beech bark disease rating so that we look at tree survival. One paper that is fairly recent to come out of this work shows that even with beech bark disease, fairly severe disease characteristics, trees can still survive 30 years or more. So that suggests that just because a tree has signs of beech bark disease does not mean that it is imminently in danger of death. It's probably still going to happen, obviously, but there are reasons not to give up on the entire tree and stand, and to look at integrated management objectives that might be more adaptive and include multiple values on the landscape and not just solely focusing on an economic focus or a silvicultural focus or a wildlife focus in absence of the other components. So at a large scale, the body of research that has been discussed here talk about the cascading effects of this invasive disease complex, and there are implications for other invasive situations besides beech bark disease that might be useful for comparison's sake. We certainly see that there's a negative impact on diversity, and it can last for decades, but not all is lost because we understand a lot about the beech mast cycle in the case of the northeastern forest. We understand a lot about the trophic interactions between the herbivores and the carnivores and between the carnivores themselves. There are a lot of relationships between these animals. For example, in years where there's a low beech nut production and there's a mast failure, the predators will often turn to bird nests to get their protein sources if they can't find small mammals. This is certainly true of animals like American marten because they're very good tree climbers. So what does that mean for bird conservation? Beech nuts are going to have an indirect impact on those species as well. And finally, when we're monitoring, it doesn't take a lot of effort to monitor mast availability of oaks and beeches. And there actually is a mast survey that has been going on in the Northeast for quite a number of years that is mostly helmed by state biologists. But that data could be used to plan future forests, both in terms of the management and land use, as well as looking at wildlife and regulatory aspects of the landscape. I'd just like to briefly acknowledge a number of colleagues and funding sources that were immeasurably helpful in collecting, thinking about, and reporting this information. Here are many of the references used in this presentation. Thanks very much for listening and watching. This has been Stacy McNulty at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry's Adirondack Ecological Center, talking to you about beech, beech nuts, beech management, and more beech. Thanks.